Today's story from rural England looks at a man who thought he'd quite literally got away with murder until, with advances in forensic science and a change in the law, years later, he once again had the police knocking on his door. Chipping Norton is probably most famous these days for Jeremy Clarkson's pub, Diddley's Squat, and for music fans, it's also where the late Who drummer Keith Moon once lived. When we pick up today's story in the summer of 1995, 30-year-old Vikki Thompson lived in the village of Ascot under Wychwood near Chipping Norton with her husband Jonathan, her two young children, and the family dog Daisy. Daisy was a beautiful collie and couldn't have been more loved by the family, and Vikki walked her twice a day, every single day. At about 4 p.m. on the 12th of August, Vikki and Daisy headed out for their second walk of the day. It was a beautiful summer's afternoon as they headed out on their usual route in the pretty countryside and the woodland near their home. Vicky's husband knew that something must be wrong when shortly afterwards Daisy arrived home without his wife. In this pre-mobile world, of course, there was no way to track where Vicky could be. He immediately went out to search for her, and in the small community, word quickly spread that Vicky was missing, and other locals formed search parties to help look for her. The tracks and footpaths where she walked were remote and often deserted, so it was unlikely that someone would stumble upon her if she had fallen or suffered another type of injury. And being midsummer, the grass and plants were high, so she may have potentially been lying seriously injured out of immediate sight. After almost 3 hours of these searches and no sign, Jonathan called the police to report his wife as missing. And then at 7:15 p.m., someone saw an object across a field from the pathway near the railway embankment. On further investigation, they realised they had found Vicky. She was still alive, but clearly seriously injured by being hit with what appeared to be the rocks that surrounded her. Whoever had attacked Vicky had also attempted to hide the body with the rocks, but hadn't, it seemed, made much of a really serious attempt to stop Vicky's body from being spotted. Maybe they dragged Vicky over a fence from the main path to this spot in an attempt to make it look like she'd been hit by a train. Moments later, her husband Jonathan was at the scene and barely able to comprehend what had happened. It was immediately clear to him there was a lot of blood on Vicky and on the grass around where she lay. Due to the severity of her injuries, the air ambulance was summoned, and in the moments before it arrived, Vicky was still conscious and she was able to speak, though not in any coherent fashion. She wasn't able to say what had happened to her, nor was she able to say who was responsible for the attack. At hospital in Oxford, medical experts tried to stabilise Vicky, who had received 3 heavy blows to the back of her head and 2 to her face, which resulted in skull fractures and a severe brain injury. And tragically, although Vicky was in very good health, her injuries were too serious for her to survive, and the life support machine was turned off in hospital 6 days later. There was a real fear in the area about a killer in their midst, and detectives were stumped about just what could have been the motive for the attack. Vicky had been a lone female. Was it a robbery, a sexual assault? Her walk took her off the beaten track, so to be there, you'd have had to have some knowledge of the area, which meant it was pretty unlikely to have been a stranger. They also found some footprints in pathways nearby. Although the area was remote, there was still clear evidence of people being there. As we hear all the time, the finger of suspicion so often initially focused on the partner of the victim, but police very quickly eliminated her husband Jonathan from the inquiry. They were also satisfied that Vicky didn't appear to be having an affair or leading any other sort of secret life. And their investigations revealed also that Vicky hadn't been sexually assaulted. So just who would have attacked Vicky and why? A farmer and 3 local residents heard screams lasting up to 45 seconds and coming from near where Vicky's body was found. And other people came forward to say they'd seen the same local man in the vicinity, and this man was 20-year-old Mark Weston, who lived with his parents in the village. Weston had left school at 15 with no qualifications, and he worked in a variety of jobs around the area, and was currently an odd job person. He had a reputation of being a bit of a troublemaker and a bit aggressive in his nature. Many in the village were wary of him, but murder? Some thought he was the obvious person in the village to be responsible, but others felt he was a bit misunderstood and certainly not someone capable of committing a terrible crime like this. And he had no criminal record for violence, just 3 counts of obtaining property by deception in 1992 and theft in July 1995. And then police made a discovery which immediately seemed highly significant. They found a bag containing women's underwear near where Vicki was murdered, and the underwear was stained with semen. When the results came back from the forensic lab, this semen was a match for the DNA of Mark Weston. Detectives believed that he'd been in the remote pathways masturbating whilst watching any women walk past. They thought that Vicki had probably seen him do this and confronted him, which led to him attacking her. They were certain they'd found their man, and on the 13th of September he was arrested on suspicion of murder. Weston was not at all impressed with being arrested. His attitude during interviews was one of mild aggression and indignation, claiming this was just a personal vendetta against him and he'd only been arrested because it was the easy option for the police. But he then changed his story to say he was in the area where Vicki was attacked, as he had popped out on his bike to repay some money he owed to villagers, but none of them were in and so able to substantiate his story. And then when he was confronted about the bag of underwear stained with his DNA, he changed his story once again. This time he said that he had been in the region that day before Vicki was killed, masturbating with the underwear. But he insisted he hadn't seen Vicki. Detectives didn't believe him, and he was charged with Vicki's murder in February 1996, with his trial beginning in the November. Sorry to be a cynic, but just because someone is guilty doesn't mean they'll be found guilty in court. And in this case, the detectives were aware that all the evidence was circumstantial. Despite the ferocity of the attack, there was none of Vicki's blood to be found on any of his clothing, and detectives were certain that this was because he had burnt his clothes he was wearing on that day. Nowadays, with the advances in forensics, DNA might still have been found, but back in 1996, it was still the early days for this science. But if detectives were concerned that the case was not as strong as it could have been before the trial, they were even less confident when the judge ruled as inadmissible the evidence with the underwear. He said there was no proven link between the underwear and Vicki. So just like that, a huge part of the prosecution case had now disappeared. And unsurprisingly, the jury took less than an hour to find him not guilty of murder, and Mark Weston returned to his home in the village a free man. An indication of just how weak the case had been was when the jury foreman later wrote to Weston, urging him to sue the police for wrongful arrest. He told him, "I hope you are all getting on well now and hope you go ahead and get big compensation from the police as they'd no evidence of any sort whatsoever." Back home, Weston was bitter and looking to take revenge. He was convicted of harassment charges for targeting 2 local neighbours who had been involved in giving evidence against him at court. Let's fast forward to 2001. Weston was now 26 and working as a barman in a local pub when he met 15-year-old Helen Rusher, who was waitressing there at the time. They began to date, but Helen quickly realised that the charming, nice side of Weston she'd initially seen had just been a facade, and he quickly became controlling and violent towards her. He had a terrible temper, and this was exacerbated when he'd been drinking vodka, and he drank a lot of vodka. Helen was living a nightmare. She was soon pregnant, and she gave birth in May 2003 on her 17th birthday. But fatherhood didn't change Weston, and one evening when Helen wanted to buy nappies, he wanted vodka, he lost it and tried to strangle her. This was the final straw, and later when Weston was asleep, she left the house with her baby, never to return. But in the weeks that followed, she would get nasty and threatening texts from Weston, using a variety of different phone numbers, saying how he could get a group of men together from London who would kill her. One text simply said, "I killed her, you know, and I'll do the same to you." Then in 2005, the so called double jeopardy rule, which stopped people facing trial for the same crime twice, was removed for serious offences in England and Wales. This rule was removed partly to address the issue of new evidence coming to light in cases such as the Stephen Lawrence murder, and also due to the increased effectiveness of forensic evidence such as DNA sampling. Like many other police forces, Thames Valley Police established a major crime review team following this change to identify any cases that could benefit from the change in the law. And the same year, detectives reopened the Vikki Thompson murder case. Detective Barry Halliday from Thames Valley explained how they'd set up a team of 8 detectives to review all the county's unsolved murders over the past 50 years and rapes over the past 27 years. He told the media how Vicki's case was one being actively investigated, saying that certain forensic items had been examined as part of this new investigation. And this forensic evidence referred to was absolutely key to the investigation. If you recall, detectives believed that Weston had burnt his clothes, but the police still had his boots he was wearing. These had been tested for the original trial and nothing had been found on them. But on reopening the case and re examining Weston's boots, they were re examined by 2 scientists in 2008 using microscopes and halogen lamps not available back in 1995, and tiny amounts of Vicki's blood were found in the seams of both boots. Now, crucially, if the blood had been found in the seams, this meant that the blood had been deposited on the footwear when wet. The key here is the wetness, which meant that Weston would have had to be standing close to Vicki for the wet blood to soak into the crevices of his boots, and he could not argue that it was dry blood that had later found his way onto his shoes. This placed him firmly at the scene, destroying his previous defence that he wasn't there and he didn't know Vicki. The irony was, of course, after the first trial, Mark Weston did have the right to ask for his boots back. Was it lucky that the police still had the boots? Officers would argue not. Justice came back to haunt him. Weston was arrested again at his home in the village on the 21st of October 2009. To say he was surprised and anything but delighted to see police officers at his door again about Vicki's murder is an understatement. The same attitude he displayed before was on display as he told them they couldn't arrest him. But he was handcuffed, bundled in the van, and taken away to be questioned further about Vicki's murder. In 2010, Mark Weston, then 35, faced a second murder trial. Weston again pleaded not guilty to murder, and his defence was the same as before, that he didn't know Vicki and wasn't at the scene when she was attacked. But this time the judge had allowed as evidence the plastic bag found near the murder scene, containing 2 bras stained with bodily fluid which matched Weston's DNA. And crucially, Vicki's blood on his boots categorically placed him at the scene of the crime. At the end of the 2-week trial, the tension was palpable in the courtroom as the jury returned to announce that in a unanimous verdict, Weston was guilty of murder. The jury of 7 men and 5 women had taken just under 4 hours to reach their decision. There were gasps and sobs from the public gallery, but Weston, he showed no emotion as the verdict was returned. Sentencing Weston to a minimum of 13 years in prison, the judge told him, "I accept there is no evidence of this crime having been premeditated, but that fact is balanced out by the brutal and prolonged nature of the attack once it began. It seems that the reason why you attacked her was that she observed you masturbating. You attacked her in the lane, dragged her across a field, and finished her off in a railway embankment. It has taken 15 years for justice to catch up with you, but it has been done so at last today." Vicki's husband, Jonathan, flanked by their children, said the following: "So justice has been done in the court, but ultimately there is no justice in death. Mark Weston will be looked after in prison. Vicki's never coming back. The death of a loved one, be it a wife, mother, daughter, or sister, and Vicky was all of those, torments those who are left. And it is worse when it is in such horrendous circumstances as this. When Mark Weston killed my wife and the mother of our two children, he took a part of me and them that will never come back. We have to live with that. We've had to since Vicky died, and we will have to for the rest of our lives. Vicky was the perfect wife and mother, and should have been able to see Matthew and Jenny turn into the fine young adults they are today. At least now they know that truth and justice have finally been seen. So there we have it. What really hit me of this story, having researched it extensively, and you can hear my much more detailed account in episode 412 of my UK True Crime podcast, it is how personal this case was for the police officers, the lawyers, and other law enforcement specialists involved in this case. They knew that Jonathan and Vicky's wider family and friends had put tremendous trust in them, and they didn't want to let them down by not securing a conviction for Weston after all the pain they'd gone through. I think it is easy for us to sometimes forget this. We end today, as always, by thinking of Vicky's family and friends. 30 years have now passed since Vicky was attacked on that dreadful afternoon. A day when she was just enjoying a normal Saturday afternoon in the sun, walking the dog, and enjoying spending time with her family until she stumbled upon Weston. I hope you found this video of interest. If so, please do watch one of my others. Until next time, I've been Adam Lloyd.